Hello friends, welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge, where you'll get to hear stories about people getting their just desserts. In this episode, there's gonna be two stories, which are quite long, so buckle up for the ride because it's well worth it. You'll hear how a landlord uses a family to boost his property value, and what happens when supervisors do nothing at work but online shop. I hope you stay for the stories today and subscribe for future videos. This first story is titled, "Used my family for cheap labor and kicked them to the curb? That's gonna cost you." This story happened quite some time ago. I have never tried to seek out revenge before, but the way these people treated me and my family was utterly repulsive, and so here we have my first ever and hopefully last revenge story. My family lived in a house that was owned by, according to one of my family members, let's call her Mary, benevolent landlords. After they lived there for 2 years on lease, the lease expired, so they started living there on a month-to-month basis. Mary's husband, let's call him John, suggested that they renew their lease, but Mary, being convinced that they'd established a relationship and trust with the landlords, insisted that there was no need to do so. This was the first mistake. Sometime after, there was a storm that knocked over a relatively flimsy and frankly hideous chain-link fence that was built around the house. Now, because Mary and John kept important things in their yard, they needed a fence. The landlords were looking around for contractors to rebuild the fence, but John had an idea that he felt would be beneficial for all. See, John and Mary really loved the house, and they were hoping to someday buy it off the landlords, which was something that the landlords had suggested as a possibility many times before. John suggested that he build the fence instead. He would only charge for materials required, and he would provide labor at no cost under one important condition. The landlords must promise that they had no intention of selling the house. One landlord, who we'll call Benny, not only promised John that the house wouldn't be sold anytime soon, but even went as far as saying that they would only ever consider selling the house to John and Mary. And so a deal was made. John would rebuild the fence more beautiful than before, and Benny and the other landlord would ensure that John and Mary would get to keep living in that house, enjoying the fruits of their labor, until the day the landlords finally decided to sell the house to them. John and Benny agreed upon what the dimensions and the material of the fence would be. They decided wood, and they decided on the fence being fairly tall, taller than many fences around them, which is important later. John bought the materials, and Benny paid John for the expenses. Halfway through building the fence, John asked Benny about whether he wanted certain changes in the backyard that would, alongside the fence, only serve to make the land value skyrocket. Benny said he would love said changes. The next part is important. John looked Benny in the eyes and said, in no unclear terms, "If you have any intention of selling the house to someone other than us, tell me now, and I will stop this entire project. I'm only interested in building this under the condition that I will get to enjoy it." Benny responded equally clearly, "John, you and your family will get to enjoy this home indefinitely. Feel at ease and do whatever you want with this yard." And so the fence was finished, and it was beautiful. This is the part where I come in. I come to visit my family, and I help them finish the fence and clean up the yard. I wasn't particularly happy with the terms of agreement, but since it was all done verbally, there was nothing that could be done now. Now comes the part where my family gets royally screwed. Not so much as a week after the fence had been built, Mary gets a call from the other landlord. Let's call her Jane. Jane tells Mary that something unexpected has occurred. See, her niece is currently on the market for a house, and she really wanted to see this particular house that John and Mary were living in. Mary, who can feel herself getting riled up, asked Jane how this could be. The fence was only just finished, and they're considering selling the house. Jane assures Mary that her niece will most likely not want the house, but as a nice gesture to the family, she has to let her see it. Now, I'm not sure about the details that happened shortly after, but it seems that Jane's niece didn't like the given price of the house, which was now way more valuable than it was before, and she chose not to buy. Bullet dodged, right? If only. Benny came to visit John and Mary with something they'd always wanted. Suddenly, the landlords wanted to sell, and an offer was made to my family. Now, My family's not very wealthy, and they would have preferred to have been told well in advance of the intention to sell. But nonetheless, the offer that was presented was not unfair, and my family said yes. Excellent. As soon as my family was approved to purchase the house, Benny came back with a change. The landlords no longer wanted to sell the house at the original price. Instead, the price they had in mind had now skyrocketed to roughly the same price as the most expensive house in the area. A price that John and Mary could no longer afford, and certainly more than the house was actually worth. That's not the worst of it though. Suddenly, the landlords needed to sell the house immediately. John said to Benny, "We had a deal." And Benny responded that they suddenly needed the money because of some family member's needs. Later on, the story changed to them no longer needing the money. And then it was Jane who needed the money because of some other piece of completely fabricated story. The point was, they wanted to sell the house now to line their pockets, but they could never stick to a single excuse. Again, John told Benny they had a deal. Benny's response, "I don't remember that. We never got anything in writing, so we never had any deal." Jane later told me that a verbal agreement doesn't mean anything. Unfortunately, in the eyes of the law, they were right. Nothing could be proven. We couldn't force them to sell the house to my family at the original price, and we couldn't force them to let my family keep living there. All right, thought my family. We just want to get paid for the labor that we put into the fence then. Of course, Benny and Jane didn't want to pay. My family members needed that money, given that they were getting kicked out on such short notice, and the money was needed to find a new place to live. Benny and Jane, however, insisted that they'd always been fair with the rent, and they simply didn't owe my family anything. I told Benny and Jane that we would take things to court and have a judge decide. Given the fear of court, Benny and Jane decided that they would pay my family, but the labor for this gargantuan monstrosity of a beautiful fence just wasn't worth that much more than the materials it was made of. He said that the labor couldn't possibly be that much, and they reasoned. Also, they would only pay for the labor for the fence, not for the rest of the work that was done on the yard. Well, everyone decided to get an estimate. The average we got from companies around the area was $3,000 for the labor. Benny and Jane managed to get one estimate from their family member at $350. What a joke. The day to leave arrived, and Benny and Jane paid my family for far less than what the labor was actually worth, and my family left. We lost, and we lost so much. The effort that went into building the fence, with the intention of getting to enjoy it, under the agreement that they would get to keep living there, just to have it taken away and barely even get paid for the labor, we got screwed over by those idiots. That was unacceptable to me. We couldn't win anymore, but I didn't want them to win either. So, revenge. I read up on fences. I learned far too much about what was and what wasn't allowed when it came to fences. I memorized every rule. I learned when permits were and were not needed. I learned what the allowed dimensions were. I learned about whether fences needed finish, and oh boy, the things I learned about fences. I learned that you don't need a permit if your fence gets damaged, so long as you're rebuilding the exact same fence. But this was wood, and the old one was chain link. I learned that the fence needed to be painted, but this one was not. And I learned that when you build fences, you had to have a very specific height limit, one which this fence violated, and that was the big one. Benny and Jane were so happy to stick to the letter of the law when it came to screwing my family, so I decided that I too would stick to the letter of the law. Somehow, the county found out that this fence was permitless, unpainted, and far too tall. Shortly after the county found this out, Benny and Jane got a visit from the county right before they managed to sell the house at their obscene price, and wouldn't you know it, their fence was built illegally. Now sometimes, you can just get a permit after the fact, but their fence wasn't allowed to be built the way that it was. There were no plans, no inspections, nor anything else the county required, and it had to come down. My family got a very angry call. The landlords accused my family of never getting a permit, which was something that my family literally couldn't do, given that this was not their property. Besides, it was the landlords who assumed no permit was needed, and my family knew nothing about how permits worked. So the fence had to be torn down. There goes the money they saved by not paying my family, and they lost their prospective buyer, so there goes the money they wanted to make. Without the fence, the value of the house went down, so there goes the price point they wanted to sell the house at. In the end, they needed to build a new fence since no one would want to live in this house without some sort of fencing. And it looks like they'll need to pay for a new fence and labor from an actual contractor after all. We didn't win, but neither did they. Lesson learned. Always get things in writing to protect yourself. It would have been much easier if papers were signed, but I doubt that would have happened if it came down to that, since it seemed they were just unfortunate to have shady landlords with hidden intentions. This next story is titled, Online Shopping While We're Dozens Deep in Queue? Not anymore. This is actually from a few years ago, but I just remembered it and it made me laugh, so I wanted to share. I worked for a few years part-time in reservations for a large casino and resort. We were frequently short-staffed on any given day, leaving us deep in queue and seeing some pissed-off customers once we got to them. It was very draining, and we had lots of turnover. There were 3 to 4 supervisors present during each shift in the middle of the room, while workers surrounded the edges. During the day, we'd make trips up to their mid-floor office to hand in forms, sign things, etc. They almost never jumped on lines to help us with the queue though, somehow always too busy to help. One day, there's about 25 people in line, and I go up to have them sign something. The supervisor does not see me approach, and I notice that she's online shopping for shoes or something. She attempts to quickly change the window, but it was too late. At my work, the supervisors could use internet freely, if they were not busy during work, but we workers were not allowed to use the internet at all, even during slow times. I decided that it's so stupid that they get to do this and be able to online shop on the company clock while we were swamped in line trying to deal with people all day. So I figured out how to keep them busy all day, permanently, so no more online browsing could be done. We had these things called profile merge slips. Basically, when a customer would call in to make a reservation, you could check our customer database to see if they've stayed before. You could sort by name, by player's number, etc. But many would not do this, or wouldn't do it correctly. Therefore, you'd end up having half a dozen profiles for the same actual customer. One duty that was a part of the job was that when we encountered these during our normal duties, we were supposed to fill out these slips with the person's name, etc., and highlighting what you believe to be the correct profile number if you thought there was one. These were then submitted to the supervisors for them to correct within the database in their spare time, as we workers did not have the ability or authority to make these edits and corrections within the database. You might normally turn in 1 or 2 of these slips each week, but I decided to do these with every spare second that I had, since we couldn't do much else. I systematically began going through the entire customer database of at least 20,000 profiles, beginning with the last names with the letter A. I easily made dozens of these profile merge slips every shift. My record was 104 in one shift. Each of these profile merges probably took 20 minutes each for the supervisor to review and implement the changes. Sometimes they'd come back to me with not sufficient info for merge. I didn't care. I knew this, and I'd submit them anyways just to keep them busy. As you might guess, this cut into their spare time free-for-all. No more online shopping. So I do this for about 3 months, and they're getting so backed up now. Each day, I'm getting the approved and denied profile merge slips in my inbox, for ones that I'd submitted several weeks ago. As time passes, they get more and more behind, and here's the best part. We are suddenly given a policy change. We can now use the internet on our spare time. Great! The internet was no longer allowed only for supervisors. I know this was purposely directed towards how I was using my spare time, as it was never given a sincere thought before this. Basically, they'd finally be allowing us the same rights that they had in an attempt to give me something preferable to do with my time instead of profile merge slips. Nope, I still kept at it. I never stopped submitting those bad boys every chance I got. By the time I put in my 2 weeks resignation, they were 3 months behind in profile merge slips, and they were required by job to go over them and approve each one. It took months just to get through one letter of the alphabet, and I had only gotten to the letter H. I left that place so happy, knowing that the workers finally got to use the internet because the bosses didn't like doing extra work, and they essentially lost their own ability to use their spare time on the web. Shouldn't have been online shopping while there was work to do. not all heroes wear capes. OP did way more work than they were required for months, and in the end, won internet use for all the workers for many years to come, and got sweet revenge on supervisors that were taking full advantage of their position. Someone get this person a gold medal. Or an ice cold beer. You deserve it, OP. And that's it for today's episode of r/ProRevenge. If you enjoyed these two stories, give it a thumbs up and leave a comment. If you aren't subscribed and this is your first time hearing a story from the channel, consider subscribing as I release new videos almost every day. See you guys in the next one.